Hello, my name is Debbie Boone, and I want to welcome you to my podcast, The Bend, where we explore how successful people navigated the path and emerged in a better place when life threw them an unexpected twist. It's inspired by one of my favorite sayings: the bend in the road is not the end of the road unless you fail to make the curve. These conversations will hopefully help you and inspire you to embrace your personal bend and to flourish. I hope you enjoy it, and if you need help with your own personal navigation and you're in veterinary medicine, please feel free to reach out to me at Debbie Boone 2 Manage Vets Consulting. Enjoy the bend and be inspired by our wonderful guest. Welcome. All right, welcome everyone to today's episode of The Bend. I am your host, Debbie Boone. Today I am super excited to have someone I have just met for the first time, but have admired because I have stalked him on LinkedIn, looked at his artwork, his amazing remarks about veterinary education. I think that's what caught my attention was his some of his comments about who's teaching us. It's the other part of it too, and sponsorships of education. But this is Dr. Rick. I call it LeCouteur, but he told me in Australian that seemed to be a little she, so it's LeCouteur. And we're going to call him Dr. Rick for the rest of the show. He is a huge animal advocate, being a veterinarian, growing up in Australia, and was on the faculty of the university. He graduated from the University of Sydney, and then was at the Ontario Veterinary College, neurology and neurosurgery at the School of Veterinary Medicine, University of California, PhD in comparative pathology. He has so many attributes to his resume. It's kind of amazing. But he's conducted lectures in laboratories in 70 different countries. But I think the fascinating thing about Dr. Rick is not only is he an amazing educator, which his students have awarded him many accolades for, but he is also a children's book author, an amazing illustrator, and a huge advocate for conservation and wildlife. And I'm right there with him because I live on a salt marsh, and we have both had a conversation where we talked about how cool crabs are today. So anyway, so Rick, thank you very much for coming onto the show.
Oh, my pleasure, Deb. Thank you very much. I'm always very embarrassed when people make my history look so glamorous. As with everyone, there have been ups and downs, but thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here today. And welcome to your audience. I hope they find our discussion interesting.
Well, I am sure they will because, we talked about the bend in the road, and obviously through all your different career changes and everything from teaching and then private practice and back to teaching and now leading wildlife expeditions and photography expeditions, which is like one of my bucket list things to do is to go to an African safari. Ever since I was a small child, I always
Ah,
wanted to do that, and
we'll have to
not to shoot
rectify that.
anything, but to photograph things. That is my goal. But let's just talk about the things that we both have a long history in veterinary medicine, and I feel like the advantage that we have is that long telescope, right? Looking back over a lot of changes and things that have happened, and the whole purpose of this show is to talk about changing things for the better in veterinary medicine. So, over your years, you've obviously done a lot of teaching and inspired your students because I've seen the comments from some of your former students who just think you were wonderful. So, look, what inspired you to challenge the status quo as you were going through all the things in veterinary medicine, working in academia, which I have to tell you would make me beat my head against the wall if I had to do it. And what do you see kind of as our future going forward? That are we changing for the better? Are we getting worse? What do you think?
Wow, how much time do we have, Deb?
About an hour.
Uh, of course, that's a question that's very close to my heart. To answer your question and then qualify the answer, what really inspired me to challenge the status quo in veterinary medicine was not rebellion for the sake of rebellion. It was my curiosity. I from an early stage of my career, I was surrounded by remarkable people, veterinarians, technicians, alumni, and even administrators, some of them. But I noticed something interesting, and that was that even in our profession, which is built on science, many veterinarians particularly had an attitude that basically says, I'm going to persist with this because this is the way we've always done it. And I found that mindset, that you could call that a form of dogma, to be the opposite pole of curiosity. And curiosity, of course, is the most astounding and wonderful ability that a veterinarian can possibly have. And veterinarians manifest that in many ways. But I started to ask questions. Why do we do it this way? Is there any evidence that what we're doing now is the best approach? And I've written a lot about the corporate influences on veterinary medicine. I've written a lot about distributing teaching to private practices. I've written a lot about naming rights. Why do people have to name things after themselves? And ask myself just one question, which is the curiosity part. Could we do it any differently? Now, I never ask, could we do it better? Because there's always a different way to do something, but is it better? I'm not sure it always is. And as current situations make me think, it's better to sort of have some idea whether what you're about to do is going to make your world a better place before you do it rather than afterwards. And that's as close as I'm going to get to anything political today. But I've always been inspired by that curiosity regarding dogma. And another source of inspiration for me that inspired me to question some of the status quo was mentorship. I think mentorship is very much underrated. We talk now about graduating veterinarians that are practice ready. No,
No, they're not.
no. And if we go in that direction,
Yeah.
we're going to miss the point
Mhm.
of knowledge, wisdom, and curiosity. And so I think we should graduate veterinarians who are ready for practice, not practice ready. And mentorship is what follows. Mentorship to give them several years of careful instruction. I've even gone as far as to suggest that they should have a provisional veterinary degree until they've done 1 year out of school. This has fallen on very deaf ears,
I'm
but
quite sure it has. I love the fact that you said that because as someone who managed hospitals for 23 years, one of the things that we always did was hire new graduates. And the reason we wanted new graduates was because they had no bad habits and they were malleable. And we had a great program of teaching. Of we walked them into rooms with experienced doctors. We didn't just go say, "Here, I'm going on vacation," which we know all happens to them. And we coached them on business, and we coached them on communication, and we coached them on their caseload and how to manage different cases. And many of those doctors still work in those practices, and 9 of them actually went out to become practice owners. So I feel like if we define mentorship, and of course you know as well as I do that now students are kind of coached by the career development folks at the academic level to say go and ask about mentorship. And the practice owners, of course, are desperate for veterinarians to go, yes, we do mentorship. And then they don't define it. They kind of look at, say, yeah, I look over your records and then I move on and leave you on your own devices. And that is
that's
not
absolutely true.
mentorship. That is not mentorship.
No, no.
Yeah.
So, as far as inspiration goes, I think every profession, and you've just mentioned the medical profession, I think every profession benefits from those of us who step back, from time to time and examine these basic assumptions, these statements that people make, which sound great, practice-ready veterinarians, but there's so much behind that. And I never set out to criticize our profession. My goal is always to strengthen it. And so I look at my grumbling, if you want to call it that, as an act of care for the future of veterinary medicine, not as tearing it down, but actually challenging the profession to make it better. It's the most amazing profession in the world, and who gets to go to work every day and look after animals? I mean, and as you know, Deb, almost everybody on your program who is associated with veterinary medicine, when you ask them why they became a vet, they'll say something to the effect of, I love animals. I've always loved animals. I had a rabbit when I was a kid. I used to watch birds in the trees around my house and wanted to know more about them, and so on and so on and so on. But that's I think being a little bit lost in our profession.
Yeah.
I think to go back to those roots for these people who are facing so many challenges in the profession today, examine why you became a veterinarian in the first place.
Hmm. Yeah, I have taught a lot of practice owners that I consult and coach with to go back to the basics of mission and vision and purpose, because it is my firm belief that people don't work for money. They will come to work for money, but they will not work with all their heart for money. They will. I said I've seen people volunteer and just work their fingers to the nub in volunteer situations where they're getting paid nothing, but their heart is there. And then, I've seen extremely well paid people still goof off and hate their job, but they're still getting paid very well, but they still don't do it with everything they've got. And we cannot pay people enough to do it. They have to be purpose driven. And we have the best purpose in the world if we can continue to pull ourselves back from all of the chatter that is out there about all the different things that are wrong with the profession. I think the loudest people are the ones who are the complainers who think something's wrong with it. And as someone who's spoken to literally hundreds of veterinarians and veterinary team members, most people love it. Most people love their work. And they quietly go about their day to day business, loving their clients, loving their patients, and loving their teams. And it's not easy. It is not easy. And clients are difficult, and patients sometimes try to eat your face. And it's just the
Or
name of the
patients
game.
die
Or
sometimes.
they die. That's right. And, as I see a lot of things that you're talking about, particularly um, that caught my attention was talking about the sponsorships of big pharma in education, and how we kind of getting tunnel vision that says this is the only thing we learn about is the sponsored events, when there's so much other stuff out there to learn. And as someone who has trained for over 20 years communication, client service, and you are a neuroscientist, so you understand the neuroscience of human behavior. If we can teach that, then we are solving a lot of the problems in veterinary medicine, because it comes down to poor communication and not understanding the animal that's on the other side of the exam table, not the four-legged one, but the two-legged one.
It-
But
exactly.
we don't get
I
many takers on those classes.
No, well said, and I couldn't emphasize those words enough. I'm always struck when I'm talking to somebody who's being very, very negative about every aspect of veterinary medicine, and I say, well, my only suggestion for you is that you retrain and do something else. What do you mean, retrain? I love what I do, and that's the disconnect
Right.
that you're talking about.
Yes.
And I think that's very, very important aspect. It is a wonderful profession. We
Yes.
do, we do the best work we could possibly imagine doing, and we have those highs and we have those lows, and any particular day can be a roller coaster, but if we try to discover why we're doing it in the first place, I think it helps us through even the worst of days. And it's not because a corporate person is dictating a protocol, and it's not because the practice is hiding the fact that it's corporate owned from its clients, and all of that is part of it. But that's not where the spirit or the essence of veterinary medicine is. And so I think if we all go back to the idea that, and I know you talk a lot about teams, if we go back to the idea that we're all part of a team and working together, that to me is the basis of everything that is wrong with veterinary medicine. We've started to think that some team members are more significant, more valuable, more wealthy, more knowledgeable, more goal-oriented than everybody else. Well, any team is only as strong, to coin a very often used phrase, as its weakest link.
Hmm.
And so I'm in the business of building curiosity about veterinary medicine. And when I talk about corporate greed, corporations have done a lot of wonderful things for veterinary medicine,
Hmm.
but there is a level at which their need to deliver for private equity, their need to deliver a return for their shareholders, their need to control the profession because it is a competitive market for them. That takes us into territory that I find very difficult to deal with, and I am critical of it, not to change it, but to make people aware of what is happening.
Yeah.
I don't understand why we don't have more trust and transparency in our corporate chains. Some do. Of course, I'm generalizing,
Yeah.
but by and large, that's one of the largest criticisms that I have is if it is as good as you say it is, show me, don't tell me, and
Right.
don't hide things from me that demonstrate the truth.
Hmm.
And so I've always been an advocate for truth in all things and honesty, and of course those breed trust or build trust. So to me, we're at a turning point. We're on a precipice.
Hmm.
If we don't start to face some of these business realities, and by the way, I am by no stretch of the imagination a businessman, business savvy. If we don't start to consider these things, we're going to destroy aspects of our profession that have made us what we are.
I agree with you. And again, we're talking about having a long view of the profession of over 40 years, for me and a little bit longer for you, that I see so many good positive changes that have happened to make us. I mean, if you had told me when in 1985, when I spent my day talking about fleas because I'm in the South and dispensing 30 count prednisone like it was candy, that we would be doing MRIs on animals. First of all, I wouldn't have known what an MRI was because it didn't exist. But the fact that anybody would even be interested in affording to pay for that would have been completely shocking. And as we, kind of moved things, and Bob Jones and I've had this conversation. Dr. Sharon Barnett is the person who created the molecule for program, as I'm sure you know. And I said, Sharon, you realize you changed the entire face of veterinary medicine. And she just kind of grinned. She said, it was a mistake, right? And I went, yeah, I do. It was a mistake because she was doing crop science and it just happened to find out that this uh, it actually worked against fleas as they were working on some kind of cornworm thing.
We
But
call that serendipity.
it absolutely is. And they took advantage of it. They definitely took advantage of it. But when that happened, the flea conversations that I used to have changed all the time. But also the thing that changed was the animals that could not come in the house were now welcome in the house. And then once they got into the house, they become more beloved than
They
ever.
work their mysterious ways.
They did. And they went from sleeping, in maybe a kennel in the laundry room to now they are in the bedroom, but now they are in the bed kicking their humans off in the middle of the night. So the transition of that from that point in time and looking at it now is just kind of incredible. But it also made it harder, I think, because now people are more emotionally attached to their animals. Not to say they didn't love them in the 80s, they did, but we're dealing with a generation of people who are using animals as surrogates for children and still have limited financial means to take care of those animals. And no matter what we do, they have shorter lifespans than humans, and we still will have to deal with the death of animals. And so I feel like these are some of the things that we are not preparing veterinary students for is financial obstacles and dealing with excessive grief and emotion. And they take that burden on. But you have to know, what's above your pay grade. And you have to network that out to people who are experts at grief counseling or financial, assistance. And it's, we can't do everything. We can't do everything. Yeah.
Yeah, the profession is no longer one cohesive unit. It used to be very, very simple, but
Mhm.
you described the path very eloquently, and I think that has changed what veterinarians do and how they have to approach their lives. But I don't think it's changed the essence
Mhm.
of who they are. And there is a disconnect. We've become very business oriented, and people answer that when I say that, people answer by saying, well, it's a tough world out there. We have to charge more because the supply chain is more expensive, and people are asking for more sophisticated treatments. And do you know how much it costs to keep an MRI running? And I accept all of those things, but an area that I get into, not as an excuse for not offering the best possible treatment for an animal, but as a reason to offer uh, standards of care. I I have become a little bit wary of the term gold standard because I don't think it's served our profession well. You mentioned just now that we're pricing a lot of people out of being able to seek veterinary
Mhm.
care for their animals. We're teaching people that only the most expensive processed food will work, and if it costs more, it must be better. And then we go to prescription diets and proprietary diets, and a whole area that I'm also rather constructively critical of. And so we lose our way.
Mhm.
And the standard of care thing, I think, is an obvious place where we can educate and practice our profession with more compassion.
Mhm.
And I think, looking back to my own history, I went to Australia after many years in academia, not because I was disillusioned with academia, but because Australia didn't have a neurologist, and I wanted to. So I established a neurology, neurosurgery practice from scratch, and uh, the skepticism, the suspicion from all the established vets in Sydney, where I set this up, was unbelievable to begin with. I wasn't prepared for that. They certainly used the idea that veterinary medicine in a specialist clinic would be far more expensive than what they do to their advantage. And then one day, can I tell a short story?
Absolutely. That's what
Uh,
makes it
one
fun.
day, one day it all changed, and at the basis of this story is the answer to part of the question that you were posing. So I was in Australia. I'd opened up my clinic, and I had a moderate amount of business, mostly from veterinarians who knew me before I ever went back there. And so things were okay, but not great. And then one Sunday, I got a call from a veterinarian north of Sydney who said, I have a dog that's fallen out of a tree and fractured its spine. And my attention immediately went to what was it doing in the tree. Turns out it was a border collie, and if you don't know, border collies are great tree climbers.
Yes.
This dog was 40 feet up a tree chasing a magpie,
Oh
and it
my God.
fell. And the owner had a two-story house, and there was this black and white flash past the window, And she thought it was one of the magpies, but then the dog couldn't be found, and they went out and discovered that the dog had fallen 40 feet and fractured
Oh my good
its
grief.
back. So the veterinarian said, I would like to send this dog to you tomorrow on Monday. And I said, absolutely not. And he said, I was told you were looking for business. You're trying to establish a practice. And I said, oh no, I'll see the dog, but I'll see it as soon as you can get it here. And the dog came down. We operated it on that Sunday. It had a prolonged recovery, but went back to all the basics that I think a neurologically severely injured animal should have. It peed and pooped outside. It recognized its owners. And so it was a very functional pet, despite the fact that it had a little hitch in its get along.
Yeah.
And so I noticed my business started to boom. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand it. So I started to ask clients. The very first one I asked, or I set out to ask clients, very first client I questioned, I said, how did you come here today? You've come 300 miles. How did you know? And she said, oh, for the past month, we've been receiving an update on the dog with the fractured spine. It belongs to the hostess of the most widely watched breakfast program in Australia, and she on the radio on the airwaves, and she was giving daily updates about her dog and saying, "This man saw us on a Sunday." Well, I didn't do anything out of the ordinary. I had a wife who was already absolutely cognizant of the fact that I was going to interrupt every family function by going in and operating on a neurological problem. But she radio host had given a very honest appraisal of what had happened and the improvement in her dog. And I realized then, getting back to your point, I realized then what an important part compassion plays in the business side of veterinary medicine. I couldn't have spent enough money to market myself that way. I
Mhm.
just simply did what almost, if not every veterinarian listening to your podcast would do, which
Right.
is you don't let the sun set on certain things. You don't let the
Right.
sun set on a vertebral column fracture. You
Yeah.
just don't, because the dog could move in the middle of the night and render itself completely paralyzed permanently.
Hmm.
So I just was being a decent neurologist, a decent vet with compassion, putting the animal first. And I don't think many of us celebrate that aspect of who we are.
Hmm.
We are extraordinary people. I don't know a single veterinarian, honestly, Deb, I don't know one that I've ever met or ever spoken to who wakes up in the morning, jumps out of bed, and says, today I'm going to harm an animal.
Right. Exactly right.
It's
Exactly right.
exactly the opposite,
It
isn't
is.
it? And
It
what
is.
a wonderful way to start every
Yeah.
day.
Yeah.
And with that mindset, even when there are a lot of other pressures in everyday life, particularly if you have children, that's not said with any malice or
Mhm.
forethought, that's just a fact. Um, and if you start every day with that approach,
Yeah.
which reminds me of something else very briefly, because I can do it on a video. When a student would come to me in the hospital with something that I thought was a little bit, let's just say, less than positive, I would make a big A with my hands like that. And every student in my classes and in the hospital knew that when I made the A sign, it wasn't for some of the obvious meanings of that letter these days. It was to say attitude. Change your attitude.
Hmm.
There's got to be a solution to this. You're just stuck on the problem end.
Yeah.
You're not looking to the solution end. And that became my little signal, which I used for 30 years, and it stopped everything, and it caused an immediate change in approach.
Yeah.
So
I love
um,
that. I
I
love
think
that.
veterinarians lose sight of the big A, their
Right.
attitude.
Yeah. Yeah. it's something that I've taught for many years. Um, we have a tendency as humans to have negativity bias. And I've had veterinarians who will look on the internet and they will have 99 absolutely five-star glowing reviews, and then there's the one.
Ah,
And the one that wasn't happy and didn't like, and they stress about that one review. And I went, I don't know about you, but as a consumer, I look at reviews and I'll go, oh, great vet, great vet, great vet. And then I'll go, oh, jerk, because that's the client that's the jerk. And if I see a lot of those, now I'll go, this is questioning the team, like what's going on here. But the one off one out of the 100 or 200 that you have that think you walk on water, um, the consumer is wise now and knows better than that. But because veterinarians, I love them dearly, but they are such perfectionists. They just cannot stand the fact that that one person did not think that they were perfect. So I try to do a little coaching, and you're talking about at the beginning of the day, starting out and saying, oh boy, I get to help animals. But at the end of the day, before we close that door behind us, we need to stop and pause and go, today, I saved this one. I celebrated a new puppy. I, pulled baby teeth. I saved the animal who impaled itself on a stick. I did all these wonderful things, and all of those clients were like your radio host who thought I walked on water. And yes, there was the one lady who complained constantly about money, but you know what? Maybe there's something going on in her life. I can remember very well being a very young manager and explaining to a lady why we could not consistently give cortisone injections to her pet without doing a physical exam at least every other month, that it was part of our protocol. And she just went on and on and on. Now, you got to remember, this is way back. And I finally just looked at her after I had been as patient and as nice as I could be. And I printed out her little one-page record and I slid it across the counter and I said, lady, I won't kill your dog for 20 bucks. And if you want to, you need to go somewhere else. My entire team was like, what did you do? And I said, sometimes you have to stand your ground with people because you cannot harm an animal, right? That is not part of your job, is to harm an animal. And if the consumer wants you to do that, then it is absolutely okay to say, we are not a good fit for each other and kindly take your business elsewhere. But we stress about that. We stress about those things. Now, that's not to say that if I had not educated the client as to why it was important to do that and just said, too bad you have to pay it, that would have been my fault. But I had spent 30 minutes educating this lady about the reasons for it, and she still didn't care. She still didn't want to pay for it. So I'm like, you know what? You're not our person, and you have to let them go. But I feel like that's some of the training that we miss with young veterinarians because I'm seeing in especially since COVID, because I feel like a lot of those students feel like they missed a lot of the in-person work that they typically would get going through clinics um, and so there's a lack of confidence that I had not seen in older generations of veterinarians. And I have interviewed literally hundreds of veterinarians in my career. And I feel like that lack of confidence worries me probably more than almost anything else because you have to have some guts to do what we do, right? And I'm not a veterinarian, but I have been around it a very long time. And you have to be brave to take a scalpel and cut into some animal's back, right? That's not for wimps.
so,
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 yeah.
so many things come out of what all that you just said that each one I could talk for ages about. But yes, um, confidence, yes, which comes with good mentorship, good sound knowledge of the basics, and a willingness to work hard. Confidence isn't a character trait that naturally one receives at birth, although some people might claim that. I think it's a behavior that can be modified. Two other things that occurred to me when you just spoke. One was one day after many years in my practice in Australia, my specialty practice in neuro. I came home and did what I always did. I told my wife about my day. We used to sit down and have dinner together, and she'd say, "Well, what did you do today?" And I would, apparently, without knowing it, I would list every single thing that had gone imperfectly. There came that fateful evening when my wife said, "I really need to talk to you. I'm quite happy if you want to change to something else. You are so unhappy with your profession." And I said, "What do you mean? I had a great day today." And she said, "Well, you just listed six things." And in that moment, I realized that I was presenting what I was thinking.
Hmm.
I wasn't prioritizing what you just alluded to, which were the great moments. And we all have that moment in a day where a little kid looks up at you examining their cat and makes that wonderful comment about, "I want to be a veterinarian when I grow up." So that just occurred to me. It's not just a matter of confidence or a matter of dwelling on the negatives. You've got to consciously every day. So I made it my business to walk in the front door. On the way home, I would think about the best thing that had happened to me that particular day. And I would walk in the door and my wife would say, "How was your day?" And I would say, "You wouldn't believe the litter of German short-haired pointer puppies that I saw today." And everything changed.
Yes.
My attitude changed, and there's the A again. Her attitude would change, and I realized that there's so much in our profession to be positive about. And the last thing I was going to comment on, Deb, was the one negative review. I used to be that person.
Yes.
Um, with student evaluations, I, although they were anonymous, I would try to work out which student had said
Who did that?
that Dr. LeCouteur or Professor LeCouteur is a terrible teacher, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
I needed to know. And then suddenly I didn't.
Hmm.
I handled it very differently, which is a way I would recommend some people think about
Yeah.
handling negative
Yeah.
reviews. I responded, not to say, not in a defensive manner,
Hmm.
not to say you're wrong or I'm a great teacher or I didn't do that to your animal or we did discuss the bill with you before you paid it.
Hmm.
None of those things. I would just say publicly, would any student who has a negative opinion, evaluation of me, please agree to have a cup of coffee with me or come to my office. I want to listen to what you have to say. I will just listen because I want to be better and I think you can help me become better so that this doesn't happen in the future.
Hmm.
Almost no students would take me up on that, but when they did, I absolutely understood why they had made that negative evaluation and my behavior improved.
Hmm.
It wasn't someone. Occasionally it was. It wasn't some misguided student who'd received a C in my class who was disgruntled.
Hmm.
It was someone that actually had some constructive feedback for
Hmm.
me. So listening is I think we're both, you and I are both talkers. My mother used to tell me, "Please remember today that you were born with too many words."
It's two ears, one mouth for a reason, right?
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly. And
Yes.
so when you synthesize a thought like that,
Mhm.
so many things come into my mind, which is why I write my blog. I
Mhm.
think I'm almost to 600 blog posts now. I wake up with and I'm sure that I will reflect on your conversation with me today, and there will be things I want to research and talk about and share. So that's what my blog is about. And
Mhm.
sometimes, I was introduced at Rotary last week when I gave a little lunchtime talk about children and children's books and anthropomorphism and all of those topics that are very close to my heart, and wildlife and conservation and how we've got to get the kids understanding what this is
Mhm.
all about because their planet is being destroyed,
Mhm.
all of those things.
Mhm.
And I realized that in the blurb that had been presented to people before they came to the Rotary lunchtime talk, it said, Professor LeCouteur is not afraid of controversy, referring to my blog. Um, I don't think of it that way. It's interesting. I hope I'm not judgmental. I hope I inspire people to respond, but it's so caught up in being a veterinarian that we are afraid sometimes to discuss controversial
Yeah.
topics.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if that's just limited to veterinarians because I coach managers and, they'll have problem employees. And well, you have to move into these situations, but you can move into them with grace if you train how to do it right. Because there is definitely a right way to do this and definitely a wrong way to do it. And when you've mentioned multiple times curiosity, that is what I always say, curiosity is your friend. Start asking questions and never give statements because statements are accusatory, especially when somebody is kind of getting called into the boss's office and they're already nervous. And you could be calling them in there to give them $100 in praise, and they're like, "Oh, I got called into the boss." So it's important for us to educate ourselves, and that was, that's one of the things I've always worked hard to do, was to constantly learn and educate. And I think one of the turning points in my teaching had to do was I was teaching at AHA conference, and as a speaker's gift, they gave us a book called Brain Rules by John Medina. And I devoured that book, and it was like light bulbs going off. And I had always trained like personality profiling and understanding the person in front of you and tailoring an experience for that person, how they needed to hear things and not the way we needed to give it. But then when I started figuring out the neuroscience of this stuff and how our brain was working, and then I got fear free certified, and I found a path to train veterinarians and veterinary teams using the parallel between fear free animal behavior and the human who was standing on the other side of the counter from them. So it's, that constant learning, I think, is what is exciting to me, and has kept me in this profession and teaching people for so long. And when you were talking about the teaching surveys, I taught trained all over the United States, and we would always do these after training surveys, and there would be 50 glowing surveys. This is the best class I've ever taken. The speaker was great. And then there would be the one. And you kind of go, were you in the same room with all these other people? And obviously, this was kind of a one-day thing, and I wasn't going to have the opportunity to see them anymore, but still hurts your feelings. You think, oh, I, did a bad job.
Absolutely.
But in looking at those things, like you said, I took those and said, what did I say that maybe they didn't appreciate? Maybe because I will, and then I started changing how I said things. Um, I was I was raised in AHA accredited hospitals. So I would start my presentation when we were talking about anything medical to say, I am a medicine snob. I want you to know it. I'm putting it out there in front of God and everybody. But there are multiple different ways to do things. And there is a clinic for every client and a client for every clinic. And so I'm going to tell you what I think and how to do this and how to present this stuff. But that doesn't mean that this is the only way to do that. And after that, things, kind of improved it. But I learned from that. And then there's always the one when you're when you're training managers, there's the manager who wants to one up the teacher. Um,
Of
and
course.
you run into those sometimes that like, oh, this is old stuff and I already know it. I'm like, well, why are you in the class? Because you don't need it. You can start teaching it. And I've often handed the mic to somebody and go, when you teach it. And then that stops them usually from doing anything else. Like, no, I'm done. It's okay. But sometimes the other thing is that people are not mentally um, open to learning. You're telling them something that makes them uncomfortable, and it shuts them down because they're now reflecting on their own behavior, especially when you're talking about communication behavior. and it will shut them down. And then you're like, oh, and so then the negative review comes out because it's made them very uncomfortable about their own self and their own behavior. So you have to kind of let that stuff go. Debbie Boone here. I want to take a quick break and thank you for listening to The Bend. As many of you know, I am a trainer, speaker, writer, and consultant working to make life better for the folks in the veterinary profession. If you're a practice owner or manager, you've felt it. Team burnout, difficult client conversations, and the constant pressure to do more with less. That's why I wrote Hospitality in Healthcare, the culmination of my 40 years of peopling in vet med. It gives you a clear, practical way to elevate the client experience while making work feel better for your team, not harder. If you're ready to lead a practice that feels as good as it performs, you can find the book wherever books are sold. Now, let's get back to my guest on The Bend.
I used to think that great teachers were born. And it's very interesting to listen to you because I've softened on that so much. I think you've got to obviously want to teach. That's the prerequisite, but you can improve so much. And the way to improve is by listening to your audience. And so to respond to that negative evaluation in a self-critical way is part of that process. I had a wonderful prof mentor. I think the reason I love talking about mentorship so much is because I had the very best. I'll get back to that point, but I wanted to just make the point. We're all the product of those who have put effort and time into us. And my first experience out of Australia in veterinary medicine was in a small practice in North Yorkshire where I spent a month observing practice. And and I loved it. On the very last day of my visit there, a month later, when I'd been traveling the Yorkshire Dales with these two wonderful vets for weeks and day and night, and had been listening to all of their ideas and philosophy. And I started off there thinking I could teach them because these were primitive Yorkshire vets. And for example, I knew all the latest anesthetic techniques for horses. And so we were neutering or castrating a stallion, and I asked what sort of anesthetic protocol they were using, and they said, just watch. Well, they got the most ancient of anesthetics. They put a mask over the horse's face, unzipped it, put a sponge soaked in chloroform in there, and zipped it up. And I thought, oh, this is going to be terrible. I've heard such bad things about chloroform in horses. The horse sunk its head, sank to its knees, rolled on its side. Halfway through the procedure, the vet said, can you unzip the mask and take the sponge out? He tied the last suture. That horse stood up gently and he said, that's how we do. That's how we do anesthesia here. And so I learned so much from those guys, and I have those stories. And guess what? Have you guessed the rest of this story yet? That veterinarian was James Herriot,
No,
Alfred
no,
White,
Rick. Oh my God.
and his partner who's known as Siegfried in the TV
Yes.
programs, was Donald Sinclair. I had spent my 4 weeks with these guys every day. They had taken me into their houses for meals. It was just amazing. I didn't even know it at the
Oh,
time.
that's amazing.
And on my last day, James Herriot, Alfred White said to me, "Ah, I've written a bit of a book, and would you like to read it?" And he handed me a manuscript, hand typed, of his book. And he said, "I'm sorry, but Donald's written a bunch of comments on it. He doesn't always agree, or Siegfried, he doesn't always agree with what I say." He said, "You know, all my stories aren't actually true because a good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And he said most of my stories had only one of those three or two of those three. He said, so I had to fill in from another experience to round it out. So he gave me this, and I remember thinking, another veterinarian who thinks they can become famous by writing a book about their experiences. How many times have we seen this crash and
Oh
burn?
my gosh.
How wrong, of course, I
Amazing.
absolutely was, and what a wonderful
Yeah.
contribution both of those people,
Yeah.
both of those veterinarians have made
Well,
to
I
veterinary
was
medicine.
I was on a call the other day, and it's a guy from Canada, and he was coming up with some kind of education platform, and he said, I don't know if in the U.S. you have this person, someone like James Harriet, and I went, yes, we do. It's James Harriet. And he went, oh, okay. I said, yes, all veterinarians know James Harriet and have read All Creatures Great and Small. And it has inspired many, many a veterinary career. Just that
And
one book.
and two very quick things. Number one, you'll read biographies and so on of him about his insecurities and this, that, and the other thing. He is a wonderful man, and I think that the series and the books catch the essence of what a wonderful man he was. But when you read the backstories, you know that he was just like all of us. He
Yeah,
had so many. Of course, they're not going to dwell on those in the TV show
of
or the
course not.
books because
Right,
that's not news for people.
right.
But he was very, very human indeed. And then the other point I was going to make is I've just about finished, well, I've finished a first draft. I'm just about to send to the publicist I use a book that I've written with the blessing of the Harriet Foundation, which is entitled, working title is Before Harriet, before he became James Harriet. And I tell all the stories because I kept a diary then, as luck would have it.
Ooh,
And I mean, for example, Siegfried was such a character. He's a character in the show, but he had so, every vet, every large animal vet works out their day's calls, and they usually do it so that they don't have to do a lot of extra driving.
mm-hmm.
And not Siegfried. Siegfried would look at the list of his calls for that day, and he would say, "It's Thursday. Mrs. Jones usually bakes a batch of scones first thing Thursday morning. If we go there for morning tea, she'll have fresh baked scones, and I know she's made some new apricot jam, and she's got a beautiful cheese that should just about have aged." And he would set his day up, which is totally in keeping with his character, based on who was
Food.
going to feed him. And by the end of the day, the back seat of his little car would be filled with all the everything from a leg of ham to a pint of milk to a batch of homemade biscuits, cookies. His back seat would be filled with all this stuff. And I just thought he was remarkable.
That's
And so
great.
I've written that side of him in little vignettes or anecdotes, and I'm hoping it'll appeal to people.
I, I,
It's a
I
little
would love to read that.
it's a little away from my children's audience, but I think uh, teenagers and young people will enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. Well, having the last practice I managed was Joe Canarney's practice. And Dr. Coates at that time was 90 and he was the original practice owner from 1948. And Dr. Coates would come in and he was a great storyteller. But I think all those old vets would have a lot of stories to
Ah,
tell. And he told a story about, which reminded me of what you said. He was going to try to drum up business. So he went out into the county and he went all to the farms and he got paid in chickens. So he came back and all he had was a bunch of chickens and he got paid that way. But he told this story about this man who had a down cow. And the neighbor, of course, not everybody had a telephone. So the neighbor had a telephone. The farmer went over to get the neighbor to call Dr. Coates and have him come out. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. He said, just cold as a witch. And he got out there and he went out, and this down cow's out in the pasture. So he examines the cow and he tells the old farmer, he said, here's what I want you to do. He said, I want you to come out here every 30 minutes. I want you to give this cow one of these strychnine tablets and a cup of hot coffee. And he got back in the truck with the neighbor and went on back down to the house. And so the neighbor said, you know, Dr. Coates, that's a little rough on that old boy to be out there in the dark in the woods and it's like 20 degrees giving that cow coffee. Is it going to save the cow? And Dr. Coates said, hell no, but he'll think twice before waiting this long to call me next time.
I
I
like
have
that. I love
never
that.
forgotten those
I
stories.
love that.
But
So
that's,
yeah, lots of little stories like that that just uh, are so true to them to those guys. But you know, people along the way. I wrote a blog some time ago now, one of my earlier ones, about the life of a veterinarian, and I loved the title and wrote around the title, and the title was, "It's about the people, stupid."
yeah,
And it is about the people.
it is.
And I look back at my time in veterinary medicine. I don't like the word career. It sort of implies that you always have a goal and direction, and that there are no bends and that there are no T intersections. But some people would call what I've enjoyed a career. I would call it a vocation, a lifestyle, a calling, and I've had a lot of wonderful people along the way. I do you know how I started off in university? Have I got time for another quick
Yes,
story?
absolutely. Yes.
Um, so I was a young graduate. I graduated from the University of Sydney from veterinary school in 1975. In Australia, things were different there. I sat in my first vet school lectures when I was 17 years of age. Of course, having been to an all-boys school, I got to university and discovered three things. Um, there was another gender on the planet which I hadn't fully understood. Um, there was a rugby club, and they had great beer drinking parties. And I'd never drunk beer. You can't till you're 18 in Australia. And I had discovered that you could own your own car. Well, of course, I failed first year veterinary medicine miserably, miserably. And so, do I tell people that when I talk about my so-called career?
Uh-huh.
Um, I didn't fail. I've failed very little
Uh-huh.
in the examination sense since, but it taught me obviously
Yes.
the lesson is self-explanatory. So what I'm trying to say to you, Deb, is I graduated as a what I called in those days a party vet. I was the guy to invite or to help you organize your rugby party or whatever. But I had missed a lot of lectures because of that behavior. And I realized when I graduated that I needed what we've already discussed. I needed careful mentoring.
Hmm.
So I did join a practice where the old fellow who owned it had that gene, and he was absolutely wonderful. And I began to learn what veterinary medicine was all about. And after a couple of years of that, I found out something very new in the 1970s, that there were these programs in the United States called internships. And I
Hmm.
thought, that's what I want to do. So I applied to 20 schools, 26 schools, I think there were then, and was rejected by everybody, at least by those who bothered to respond. Of course, so many things were wrong with my application. I'd failed a year of veterinary school. I'd been a mediocre student. Um, but I thought, Deb, I thought if they meet me, if only they meet me, they'll realize that my academic record means very little.
Hmm.
So I determined to buy a one-way ticket to the US. I hopped on a plane and I flew to the US, and I ended up on one of my stops at the Ontario Veterinary College in uh, Canada, Guelph. And I walked up to the front door, pack on my back, and said, I'd like to talk to whoever's in charge. Oh, what do you want to talk about? I want an internship. Oh, made an appointment to speak with the department chair, who turned out to be a very famous veterinarian, James Archibald, who was one of the first, who wrote one of the first veterinary surgical textbooks, and he's passed now, but what a wonderful man. And I met with him, and he explained to me that there'd been over 200 applications for this one internship position, and that I was not in the first 100. He said, actually, you weren't in the first 190. Well, talk about a lesson. And I said, well, can I stay and nobody's ever been that honest with me. Can I stay and see what it takes to be? So he said, sure, stay as long as you like. So I stayed there a few weeks. And at the end of that, he wanted to see me. He called me to his office and he said two things. He said, number one, Rick, he said, a lot of people are telling me I should find an internship for you based on your interest and your willingness to learn and pay attention. And he said, the second thing is, you're here so much, people have said to me, it's almost as though you're staying in the veterinary school. Well, I was. I was. I would wait till everybody had left, and I would go and set myself up in the bathroom. There was a shower there. I could brush my teeth, and I had my sleeping bag, and I would get up early before everybody came in the morning. Well, he'd obviously heard about this, and although he didn't mention it, and so he said, Rick, I'm inclined to think that with your enthusiasm, we can find a place for you. And the rest, of course, Deb, is history.
Yeah.
He did find a place for me. 3 months later, it was an internship position, um, unpaid to begin with. I worked in the abattoir on Saturdays and Sundays um, to to pay for my keep. And by about the second or third month, he'd found me a sponsor, and I had a paid internship. And the rest is, as I said, history.
Yeah.
I stayed there for a surgical residency and then fell in love with neurology because of another person, Dr. Clive Eager, who's a West Australian, such an influence. He just turned me on to something that had fully escaped me at veterinary school. I just thought it was the most boring subject on the planet. Pathways and this and that and the other. It made no sense to me whatsoever. This man, Dr. Clive, turned that around. I owe him so much, and Dr. Jim Archibald so much, and there are so many more.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about them often.
Mm-hmm.
But the rest is history. I then did the neurology, neurosurgery residency in California, and the rest fell behind. But
Yeah.
but to any young people listening, the purpose of this story is not to tell you about my career. Remember, I have already said I don't have one of those, but it's to let you know how important enthusiasm is, and how enthusiasm, seeing the positive side of things, is infectious, and how there will be key people in your journey who recognize that special quality in you and think it's worthwhile to pursue helping you.
Yeah.
And that's been the story of my entire
Yeah.
career. And I thought that might be something to share today, because that's the that's the side of veterinary medicine that doesn't get discussed in a private equity investors meeting.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that comes across the banner of a stock exchange registered veterinary company. I don't think it's discussed in the boardrooms of most pharmaceutical companies. But our profession is one that demands enthusiasm every day. You've got to approach every client as though they're the only person you've seen that day.
Mm-hmm.
Never, I've told so many of my residents, never respond to that timeless question, how are you doing today, doc, with a negative.
Yeah.
That's your opportunity to let this next client know what a positive person you are, what a wonderful job you're going to do with their animal. And we tend to answer some questions honestly that should be absolutely not answered honestly. I've rambled on so much, Deb, but you've stimulated a side in my, as I say, usually I'm discussing the plots in my kids' books.
Yes.
By the way, can I show anybody who's
Oh,
watching?
absolutely. Because these
Um,
illustrations are absolutely amazing.
this is
And
what my kids' books look
yeah.
like. And just to open one up to show, I'll open randomly. Um, this is what the inside looks like. And
Yes.
my own illustrations taken from my photographs. And so the idea of my books is, again, not to make a fortune. I think at the end of the day, I make about 28 cents every time Amazon sells one of my
Exactly.
books.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's to reach the young people before
Hmm.
they've uh, had a chance to really understand that wildlife and conservation are such important things and such important aspects of life. And so, but you've commented on the illustrations, and I just
Yes.
wanted to say one thing. Most children's picture books, about something over 90% of them, have whimsical, fantastical illustrations.
Hmm.
Penguins eating pizzas, penguins flying, penguins going to school, which is what inspired this first book,
Uh-huh.
which I wrote about penguins, because they don't do any of those things.
Right.
So there's got to be some influence to the young kids that tells them actually that penguins don't eat pizzas, they eat krill. They don't go to school in a schoolhouse. They live in a very cold climate that's called Antarctica, and so on. And so that's the little niche I am hoping to fill. And my favorite thing, Deb, to do in the absolute world is to read one of my books to a fourth or fifth grade class and spend an hour answering their questions afterwards. That's my raison d'etre, my reason for being is to see the kids becoming so interested in authentic animal information. And I think that's one of the appeals of Harriet, don't
Yes,
you? That
I do. I really do.
stories are so authentic.
Stories, in talking to people about their practices and client education. And I said, we want to be so clinical. You're trying to teach people to be veterinarians. If they wanted to be a veterinarian, they would go to school to be a veterinarian. What they want is to understand why you want to do the things you do for the care of the animal, and they want to have some concept of the outcome. And I said, one of the best stories I ever heard a veterinarian tell a client, and he was an older veterinarian, and he said to the client who had a blocked cat, he said, all right, let me put it like this. He said, have you ever had a clogged toilet in your house? And she said, yes, of course. He said, the same principle is applying to your cat. He didn't talk about stones. He didn't talk about urethras. He just said the hose is blocked and we got to undo it. And when she went, I got it. And so the concept became really clear. And I try to teach that in training technicians and receptionists and veterinarians, is you assume that people have a baseline of knowledge because you can't imagine knowing that or not knowing it, right? Even very basic things about the sex of how to choose this, how to figure out the sex of an animal. I said, but I have constantly asked my students, how many of you have had a client walk in your door who does not know how to tell the sex of their dog? Now, the cat, I totally get, but the dog. And 100% of them raised their hands. So it happened, this came to be because this receptionist was in one of my classes, and she said, how would you answer this question? And I said, okay, let's have it. And she said, this client called up and wanted to know how to tell if his dog was male or female over the phone. And I went, okay, how did you answer? And she said, well, I kind of stammered around for a little bit. And I said, well, here's what I would have said. Turn the dog over on its back. Start at its chest. If you rub through its back legs and it doesn't stop, it's a female. If it stops halfway, it's a boy. And she said, I'm never going to forget that as long as I live. I went, break it down, right? You got to break it down for people. And we sometimes are so complex, and people don't like to appear stupid, so they'll sit there and nod, yes, I understand, doc, I understand, and come out and ask your receptionist for an interpretation of gastroenteritis. So you better train your receptionist because they're interpreting for your clients out there.
No, that's no comment on that because I agree with everything you've said. So, the art of communication in veterinary medicine, I think ultimately most veterinary practitioners become really, really excellent communicators, but it doesn't mean they can't be better,
Hmm.
and it doesn't mean that they've actually repeated basic strategies that aren't working in their favor for many years. And so the sort of thing you do in that respect, I think, is invaluable. Um, uh, I, my story to complement that is the story that surrounds my first uh, uh, interaction with emotional intelligence.
Hmm.
EI, such a overused term. In my opinion, it doesn't nearly get to the heart of things. But the first time I'd heard that expression was talking to my dean, who shall remain unidentified, and I was upset about something. I thought, I know what it was. I had been invited for 3 consecutive years to give the graduation speech to the graduating class of vet med. And the third time, he vetoed me speaking. And my point was, it's the student's choice. It's their graduation. It's not your graduation. Anyway, he stopped the conversation this way. He said, Rick, you don't have the emotional intelligence to understand this. And I didn't know what to do because I'd never thought about whether I have emotional intelligence or not. And I thought he knew something that I didn't know. Had they filmed me doing something, or had I completed a questionnaire about? So I left the room absolutely flummoxed, and I didn't give the speech that year, and I had nothing to say. And he'd used emotional intelligence, which at its best definition implies that you're actually listening to people and that you're empathetic and trying to interact in a caring way. He'd used it as a weapon.
Mm-hmm.
He shut me down. And in that interchange, I became very suspicious of behaviors that have catch names or catchphrases that define them. Emotional intelligence. And I'm going to do something that I hesitate to do, but I'm going to turn the vodcast around because I'm having met you and talked to you, I'm truly interested. What do you think emotional intelligence is or entails? You sort of half nodded knowingly when I
Yeah.
discussed it. So I'm very interested in your
Yeah.
thoughts.
Well, true emotional intelligence to me, and having read the book and done a little study on it, is the ability to control your own emotion and to help others control theirs. And so it's using your skills to be a good listener and to use reflective language and to be able to what I like to do with people when I'm having challenges with them is let them reveal to themselves the solution to a problem. And I think people with high emotional intelligence are probably good at that. And I would say that you are, and he was not, because
Well, he was very effective, though.
he would have allowed you to reveal any issue by asking you good questions about what did you think. I mean, what was the reason that you wanted to do it? What was the reason you thought it was that it could be inappropriate to do it? And he could have let you reveal that to yourself. Maybe they were, um, other people on the faculty were getting, he's the teacher's pet kind of attitudes towards you and things like that. But not to shut somebody down with it, but to understand your own reactions, your own that limbic brain response to where you're starting to get excited and ramped up yourself, and then to be able to control that and do some self-talk that says, okay, this is not, it's not
Absolutely.
helpful, right? It's just not
Yeah.
helpful. And going back, I think one of the biggest things that we can learn is to talk to ourselves. And I mean, it sounds like you were crazy if you're talking to yourself, but the truth of the matter is to be able to put that pause in place and to say to yourself, okay, I'm reacting emotionally, my hormones are kicking in, I feel under attack, and this is not true. This is false information that my brain is feeding me because it thinks I need to flee, freeze, or fight, right? So I'm going to talk to myself and pause in the breath. What is it? The Viktor Frankl between, the reactions is the pause. And so I feel like we need to learn the pause. in
I
all of
think
our
that's a
interactions.
wonderful answer. I
Mhm,
think I've thought about this incident a
mhm,
lot because it was my introduction to EI, emotional
mhm,
intelligence. And I thought how he should have handled it was to have been emotionally intelligent. And the one question he should have asked me, which would have shut me down immediately, was, don't you think someone else should have a turn? Don't you think they would enjoy doing it as much as you have?
mhm.
There's only one answer to that.
And the answer is yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Out of a sense of
absolutely.
fairness. Out of a
And
sense
that
of fairness.
and that's I hope that little personal example and your
Yeah.
response to it um, resonate with our listeners because I guess they're your listeners, but
Yeah.
right now they're ours.
They're ours. They're ours.
Because there's something in there about weaponizing straightforward concepts and ideas that is just counter to
Mhm.
intelligent conversation
Yeah.
and seeking a negotiated or a good outcome.
Yeah.
And that story sticks with me because of that.
Hmm.
He asked the wrong question.
And
I'm
it
a
makes
huge
yeah, it makes me feel like people will grab a hold of a phrase, assume they understand the meaning of it, and use it inappropriately. And that seems exactly what happened in that situation is that he thought he knew and he did not, and he did not use true emotional intelligence in that situation at all, which again would just be asking great questions.
exactly.
Hmm.
I that I thank you. I really enjoyed your answer, not only because it agrees with what I have been thinking, but I'm very receptive to contrary points of view. But it's very thoughtful, and carrying on from that, as an academic veterinarian, I think a lot about shared governance. The university has to make decisions sometimes at the highest level, but there's an art in shared governance. And I thought that thought might apply to some of what you do with veterinary practices, um, in the sense that the administration is always going to do what they're going to do. And they can do it behind closed doors with secrecy, which breeds lack of trust. And then they can announce what they're going to do. We're changing the sign on the front of the practice next week. Um, I'll let you see it when it goes up. And everybody in the practice says, wow, I sort of like the old sign. Why is this happening, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
And so shared governance in universities implies that administrators should seek the input from faculty, staff, alumni sometimes, and all the stakeholders, as we call them, which for different topics means different people. But and then at the end of that, they should come out with a statement that says and this is paraphrasing, and of course you would use much better language, but we're saying, we've listened to all of you, but we're going to go ahead and do what we'd planned anyway. Somehow that becomes more acceptable. The sign in front of the veterinary hospital that says, thanks everybody for your input. I'm sure you'll really like what we've come up with.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know whether many people are like me, but if something's inflicted on me, I try to think of every reason that I'm not going to accept it right
Exactly.
from the very first
Yes.
moment.
Yes.
But if I'm allowed to discuss, state my point of view, be heard, and then the decision comes down the opposite, I say, well, at least they listened to me.
At least they listen. When I'm talking to managers and we're talking about making SOPs and practices, I said, look, ask your staff if there's a bottleneck somewhere, they're doing the work, ask them because you're not doing that. And then maybe you can do it, maybe you can't do it. If you can't do it, it's okay, but at least you got their input. And the other thing is maybe they came up with a really great idea you would have
Yes,
never thought of. And we don't
absolutely.
have to think of everything. So I feel like sometimes the practice owners and leadership in practices I think the entire burden of thinking is on them. I went hire smart people and put them to work. Use all the brains in your team and do that. But Rick, this is we have had such a good conversation. I've had so much fun in this conversation. I can't stop without telling people about the really cool thing that you are doing now, which is leading expeditions.
Oh,
And I have to know that is such a bend from teaching at university, running practices. Now you're, in following with your conservation heart, leading expeditions into exotic places to see animals who I hope we save for very, very many generations to come.
uh, well, thank you. I don't know how little or how much time we have, but just to say that when I was starting to think about retirement, I retired in 2015, and about 2013, through lots of circumstances that are for another time, met and became enamored of a veterinarian who has spent her life in conservation, research about wildlife, taking people around the world to see wildlife firsthand. She really only spent her first year in practice and then took a research post in the Amazon jungle and basically fell in love with the outdoors. She had that. She tells so many stories. Her name is Carol Walton. I shouldn't be calling her she. Carol, Louisiana graduate veterinarian. Carol tells all these stories about having a covey of what are the birds that run around on the ground? Anyway, I can't think of the
Oh,
quail
quail. Okay,
in
quail.
her bedroom, and her father helping her build an enclosure. Well, you can imagine at the rate quail can reproduce in captivity, this was a bad idea, but her father supported her. So here's this amazing, amazing, amazing woman, and she wanted to do expeditions for veterinarians. And I met her at that critical moment. And so I became her director of education. And together we built a company called Veterinary Expeditions, LLC. It started originally just for veterinarians, particularly veterinarians advanced in their careers to actually get out there and do all the things they hadn't done because they were so busy
Hmm.
with practice and so on. And it rapidly morphed into anybody can come, next door neighbors, family, brothers, sisters, people from other countries. And these expeditions we go all over the world. Many places in Africa, Madagascar, India, Borneo, South America, Brazil, to see the jaguars, Galapagos Islands, Ecuador, Peru, and we do even do one to Australia, which is my favorite. And our concept was we're not going to take people to these places and teach them about blocked cats or kidney disease or seizures. We're going to take them to these countries and open their eyes to wildlife conservation. So we have guest lecturers everywhere we go. I give the majority of the lectures. Carol gives some of them. And we lecture when we're just back from India. We spent a little over 2 weeks in India this February. And of course, to see tigers and sloth bears and Indian elephants and all sorts of bird life. India is an amazing wildlife destination. And I give lectures that are not about all the animals so much as they are about the history of India, the history of the national parks in India. How are they going to, is the wildlife population going to survive 140 billion people all looking for a little piece of land to call their own? And so that's a long-winded answer to your question, but that's how I came to do veterinary expeditions, and it's become a passion. And I'll be absolutely honest with you, Deb. I used to go on these expeditions, and there'd be people taking photographs that were much better than my own, and so I developed an interest in photography. And then, having been exposed to conservation and speaking to kids in other countries, I realized how much the planet Earth, is missing the opportunity to educate this next
Hmm.
generation of conservationists. Not completely. I mean, of course, there are many people doing wonderful things, but I felt we could make a contribution in that area. So the books followed,
Yeah.
and it's a logical sequence. But of course, like everything in life, one thing leads to another. You've just got to see the door opening and be courageous enough. Not that I've been courageous, I've been lucky, but courageous enough to look through it to see what's on the other side of the door. You can close the door again,
Yeah.
or you can go through it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a great note for us to end on. I feel like this was encouraging veterinarians and anybody who's listening to this to be willing to open a door that's maybe not in your comfort zone. And that's quite all right because I can remember the first lecture I ever gave, I thought I was going to throw up and pass out at the podium.
Me
And now
too.
it's second nature. So we have to take a risk and we have to take a chance in order to succeed and find the really wonderful things that there are out there in the world. And somebody laughed at me one day when I said I have never played a video game in my life. And they were shocked at that. And I went, there's too many cool things outside for me to sit inside and watch and play a video game. So I'm very
So,
much
so a little bit of a confession. I never have either.
it's
My grandkids play them until I say, let's go outside and see what we can find under a rock.
there you go.
But no, I've never done it
Yeah.
either, Deb. But we're either dating ourselves or there's some wisdom in there somewhere.
Exactly, exactly. And both of us I feel like we're pretty mentally healthy people too. So that may be another caveat to if you want to be mentally healthy, go outside.
I was going to talk a lot about mental health in our profession, but I think you just encompassed my message in those few words.
Yeah, just go outside. We'll have to do this again. We could talk about a
I'm
lot of stuff.
I'm all I'm always open. I I researched your questions, and as I told you at the beginning, I learned more about myself than I was ever going to. Uh, and I really congratulate you on that. To anybody listening, Deb challenges her guests to think about aspects of what they do before they come on the program. And I've now realized it was a trap because we didn't talk about any of those things, really.
Not per se, but we touched on many of them just
We
because of
did.
conversation.
I was trying. That was my attempt at humor. However, I have learned far more about myself from this interaction, Deb, than I ever expected, and I hope somewhere in there between our back and forth, there have been some moments that resonate for people.
Yeah, I hope so too, Rick. And I really appreciate your words and your wisdom. We learn as we get older. Sometimes life teaches us good lessons, and there is a reason that indigenous tribes learn from their elders, and hopefully we have passed on some wisdom here today. Well, thank you again to Dr. Rick, and thank you to our audience for listening to us today. Again, my name is Debbie Boone, and we appreciate your time today on The Bend. We may have to put this into two episodes because Rick and I talked a lot, but we will be back for the next episode and the next guest. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, everybody.